Which part of the job is the most challenging?
I find it quite frustrating and challenging to deal with politicians. They all have their own different approaches and views. There were bridges between them, but they were very poor bridges. Politics, I think, is a game for people who are patient.
Clearly, supply, demand, affordability, if anything's got worse.
There's been a housing crisis forever. Build more homes, you lower prices. London was way behind. I think we as an industry have failed comprehensively to...
Hello and welcome to devcast, Deborah Smith's audio series where we explore the latest trends in real estate, interview influential leaders and covering the strategies that drive success in this ever-evolving landscape. Our guest today is someone whose vision and expertise has been pivotal in revolutionising the way we think about affordable housing and sustainable living in urban environments. He's one of the driving forces behind one of the most innovative companies in the industry, Pocket Living. As the Chief Commercial Officer, he's been instrumental in crafting strategies that marry functionality, sustainability and community engagement. So without further ado, let's welcome Nick Cuff to the studio.
Well, thank you. What a lovely introduction.
Well, it's all true, you know. It's all true, and you know, I've been studying and watching your career for it feels like decades, but certainly beyond a decade, and it's such a fascinating story, as is that of Pocket, which we'll come to. But if it's all right, as I usually do, I'd like to sort of dive as far back as you're comfortable. Like, what was life? Where was life? You know, those formative years pre-property. I'd love to hear about.
So I didn't start in property. I probably did things in a slightly back to front fashion because I actually started working in politics. Really, I suppose you'd call it politics. In my early 20s. So I worked for a gentleman called Ian Anderson, who's a great lobbyist, really, I suppose you call him. He might not thank me for calling him that. And he's gone on to really quite impressive things. He had a startup business, and I did a summer intern with him, and I was transfixed by his Aberdeen accent. So I didn't really understand anything he asked me because I kind of struggled to follow it, really. But for whatever reason, I seemed to make a good impression. And so I joined him for 6 weeks out of university. He was a great storyteller and very, very strong, kind of clear business operator. And so I got to sort of work directly with him in a startup, which he grew and he's gone on to sell to a large American business now. And he's now got some form of government task force role, I think. So I think he's still working in the industry, but he's also doing sort of more sort of political, more general political work as well. But he was a really interesting person to start your career with. And so I didn't have anything to do with property. I was working in politics, and then I worked in the House of Commons in the shadow opposition when David Cameron was the opposition leader, when the Conservative Party was a little bit more, well, not normal, but more mainstream than it perhaps is today. And then I also possibly took it too far because I became an elected councillor at the age of 24, which was quite a young time to do it. I was much younger than everyone else, but I was lucky to work with Sir Edward Lister, when he was leader of Wandsworth, and I got to join his cabinet as well a few years thereafter. So I got quite a lot of political experience. Enough to put me off being a politician, but enough to teach me quite a lot about how the world works, which was very, I think, been invaluable for a career in property development, which kind of is a confluence of commercial, politics, and many other things too.
I mean, it's rare. It's a rare route into the private sector of real estate, I would suggest. I can't think of too many people that I've met over the years who've run that course. So it was accidental. Property was an accident or not? Well, you were in the sort of political landscape and obviously touching it an awful lot.
It wasn't an accident. When I was working in either in politics within or in the House of Commons, I came across the property industry in many guises. Obviously, you know, there's been a housing crisis forever, so there was that element to it, but then there was also me questioning myself about, did I want to have a career in politics? And I probably felt at some point that I didn't want to do what my my managers, who were MPs and shadow ministers at the time, didn't really feel that was for me. And so I was thinking, what could I do? And actually, Mark Prisk, who I worked for, who was the shadow housing minister, actually was is a chartered surveyor, and so that gave me some kind of insight into that world, and gave me a little bit of confidence, really, to think that might be something that would be of interest to me, because I wouldn't be divorcing politics, because housing felt very political, and actually people with the skills that you gain from politics, I felt at the time, perhaps not entirely thoroughly or well thought through. I felt those skills could be of value to the housing sector, and that I could potentially progress in that industry, partly because it seemed like everything was in an impasse. So maybe if you came from, it seemed like two different worlds, property world and political world. There were bridges between them, but they were very poor bridges. But they needed more bridges, and I thought that might be something that I could do. So that's how I ended up finding property. So it wasn't so much by accident, but by just seeing from perhaps the political world how the housing world interacted.
Well, your intuition was right. I mean, I think your CV would confirm that. But am I correct in thinking you went then back and studied real estate or land? I saw that. So that was whilst working, I presume you.
So I was at CBRE. I got on the CBRE graduate scheme. So I left the House of Commons, and it was actually a bit of a shock, because you went from effectively kind of campus environment, and it was, you're thrown together with a lot of other young people, and then you've obviously got a generation step up where we've got the MPs who disappear off of a Friday, and everything's subsidised in the House of Commons, bars, etc. And so it's quite fun actually as a place to work. It's quite intense, and you're dealing with pretty senior people who certainly think they're senior anyway. And then I left that world, which I actually felt I enjoyed. It was a bit of a wrench to go to join CBRE, which was extremely corporate, in the city office, where it was you've got to be in at 8 and you finish at 6, and everyone was suited and booted and quite serious, and we were sitting next to the commercial city investment team, which back then city investment was very popular.
The gods.
Yes, these days less so. but back then very much the powerhouse of the company and the sector. So I went to that, and I did that for a couple of years, but I went straight in. Well, we went as a country into recession. When it was the 2008 property crunch or the great crash, or whatever you want to call it. And it was at one point, it was touch and go, the CBRE were going to even take a graduate scheme. And I actually had a choice between CBRE and what was then called DTZ. And I nearly went on the DTZ one, and DTZ said, well, if you're going to come on our graduate scheme, we want you to quit being a councillor. And I said, well, I'm not going to do that, because I was already an elected councillor by that point. So CBRE were more sanguine. They said, you can be a councillor, fine, just expect that you're going to be working very long hours here. So I took the CBRE one, which was good. They kept that one going. The DTZ one didn't happen. They had to extinguish that as a consequence of the market. But whilst I got the job and we did lots of things, it was a very depressed economic environment, and really all I was doing at CBRE for the time I was there was looking at stalled sites. There wasn't really much in terms of property development that was taking place. And so I, at the same time, progressed at Wandsworth, and we got through the local elections, and Sir Edward Lister asked me would I consider taking on the chairmanship of the planning committee at Wandsworth. And because there was so little that seemed to be progressing materially at CBRE, I initially said probably not, because it felt very unconventional to leave a graduate scheme which I'd fought quite hard to get onto, and I'd gone through the painful process of becoming a CBRE executive. It was tough, but I'd done that, and I felt like I'd kind of got a place there to then leave it. So I felt a bit of a shame and premature, but equally I looked at the market and I thought, well, what's going on? I looked at what was happening in Wandsworth, and I saw the Battersea Power Station, the US Embassy potentially coming, the Northern Line plans. None of this had really come to fruition, but it felt like the cycles might align between perhaps my tenure at Wandsworth as the chair of the planning committee, and all of these big schemes that were being dusted off were trying to recover from what had happened in the banking crisis, but looked like they could recover and they looked like they could come forward. So I thought this was probably an unparalleled opportunity to learn something.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, what a rare opportunity. You're still very much a young guy. How old were you at the time?
I was 28.
I don't know. I'm not an expert in local council, planning, structures and teams, but that sounds pretty rare, pretty uncommon.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was unusual to have a bit of a background. I think there are plenty of people out there, and I think increasingly it seems to me that councillors or councillor positions, particularly in London boroughs, are inhabited by people who are trying to then become MPs, and so there are more younger people in those types of roles because they see it as a stepping stone, which is it's a reasonable, logical step, I guess, to then try and become a parliamentarian. I think what was unusual was I had worked at CBRE for CB Richard Ellis for a little while, and I wouldn't say I was in any way an experienced property executive, but I had some knowledge of the sector. But I also was imbued with a view that there was a housing crisis and that we needed to get building. And I did look at London, and I did feel strongly as someone who had travelled to other cities in the world that London was way behind in terms of development and delivery. And so I felt, my own generation of friends and family and things were not getting a chance to get on the property ladder. I felt as a city, Ken had started getting things going with some of the taller buildings, but I felt London could be a lot more ambitious for the reputation it had in the world. And so I very much ideologically was pro-development, and I had a bit of understanding of how the sector worked. So I came into that role very much from the perspective of I'm going to try and get as much as I can going in this borough because we're in a great position, in a great world city that I think can do better.
And you did. I mean, I remember going to MIPIM, I think it was, way back when. And I'm sure Wandsworth had a stand at the time.
Yeah.
I lived my first flat that I bought was in Vauxhall, which I know is Lambeth, but the string between Vauxhall to Battersea and beyond, Vauxhall roundabout or Wandsworth roundabout. The map or the model that you guys created was like there was a ton of really exciting, really vibrant, diverse projects in a few square miles of London.
Yeah. And going back there now, it's I think it's a huge success. It's activated. I mean, who would have thought that piece of North Battersea, which was essentially desolate industrial and underused space, is now teeming with people, pedestrians. In the middle of the days, weekdays, weekends, there's public realm, there's activation, there's all sorts of amenity and offer. You would never have imagined, and we're talking 10, 12 years ago, that such a place would be so animated. And I always remember planning officers and committee members being greeting with scepticism these images that conjured by architects of balloons in the air, and you probably know the ones I'm talking about, but those pictures, these CGIs of buildings with lots of happy people and people sitting on grass and everyone's rolling their eyes and going, here we go, another vision which is very distorted from reality. But actually I do think that there is that in that part of London, and you can criticize it for certain things, sure, but you can criticize everything. You can always find flaw. I mean, development is trade-off effectively between various things, but it's been a success.
A huge success, and for again in your 20s to be right at the epicenter of that type of regeneration and evolution of no offence to anyone who wants it, but a relatively sleepy kind of borough, perfectly nice, but not on the global stage, I would suggest. And Battersea will be, will way outlive our lifetimes. For certain. Apple's European headquarters, US embassies, you said, just down the road, amazing. So what then? Why move on?
Well, I think I did 4 years, and it had. I mean, not everything had been achieved or finished, but I felt I'd had a good run at it, and I didn't really want to be a professional politician or indeed a professional counsellor. And I think, there was an opportunity to carry on and progress up, and the leader at the time, it changed whilst I was there, from Edward to Ravi, they were very experienced, seasoned politicians, and it was great to sit and work with them, because they were sensible. They weren't really ideological. The people say that one's a conservative and right wing and Thatcher's favourite council. I never got a sense from people like Sir Edward Lister and Ravi Govindia that they were particularly party animals, really. They were just people that wanted to improve the world and get things going, and they understood the value of investment and place, and their role was to thread the narrative between the two. They knew that the public sector doesn't have the money to do the kind of things that have happened in Battersea, but they had a very, very important role in shaping and controlling that. Controlling, not stopping, is a very different thing, but they knew how to do that, and I experienced that and I witnessed that. But I didn't think I really wanted to carry on, and the commitments involved, the time, it's evening work. If you want to use it as a stepping stone, that's another thing, and I didn't really see that. I'm quite impatient. Politics, I think, is a game for people who are patient, and sometimes it's a game of talk and back and forth, and those things were less stimulating perhaps for me. So I knew I was someone that I think probably more attuned to the commercial world. So I felt I called time on it, and I went back to the industry, and I joined Essential Living, and I was lucky in the sense that I was working with very seasoned operators again, who I enjoyed working with, and Darryl Flay and Scott Hammond. They gave me a bit of a chance there, and they capitalised the business in about 18 months of joining. So we went from being a very small business that they'd come out of the recession again, from different entities, and they got themselves out, and they were going again. They recapitalised, and they did a fantastic deal with the Washington State Pension Fund, capitalised Essential to do the first build-to-rent platform in London. So I didn't, just complete luck that I ended up joining them, but I was the first DM, the development manager that they had, and I stayed there for a couple of years and watched them build the business up for a period, and then went to Pocket after that. But that was a really interesting moment for me, because it got me into the development space, because I hadn't been a developer before that, and so it got me into the development space. But it also, I saw how a company could grow as a developer, and how you operationalize a development business, which was then very useful for going to Pocket, which was then in a similar stage of growth.
Yeah, well, credit to Darryl and Scott. They really were the first on the scene to do it. Lots of people were talking about doing it, I remember, but they really did, I think, steal a march. And
they're deal makers. They are out and out deal makers, and they are very, very unusual in their skill set, and there aren't many of them around, and I was able to learn a lot from that.
So Pocket, talk to us all about Pocket, because it's really unique from my perspective, and I think the draw was probably, well, I won't put words in your mouth, but I can understand the draw, and you've been there for 10 years now, I think. Is that right?
Yeah. So I met Mark Blessing, who he started it up in, I think, 2010 maybe, and he had lobbied me when I was a councillor at Wandsworth, and I was a little bit sceptical originally of the proposition, but I heard him out and I went to see a scheme, and I was really impressed, because I was very conscious that the price of homes in Wandsworth, even with the increase of supply, was still very much out of the reach of normal Londoners.
Yeah.
And at the time, this is the problem with the UK, but data, I felt instinctively, you build more homes, you lower prices, and that has been borne out to be true, but it's not borne out to be true in the purest sense, because firstly, planning permissions don't mean you've got new homes; they take time to come through. But secondly, if you're a borough that's building but no one else is, then actually you can be building 4,000 new homes, but if Lambeth, Southwark and the rest of them are building 20 homes, then actually it doesn't move the dial. So it was clear to me that there were also challenges around the tenures of homes that we were building, perhaps, and if not everyone is swimming in the same sea and not everyone's pushing in the same direction, then it doesn't make enough of a difference. So the pocket business model, the original model was, let's build homes which are smaller, more compact, and offer them at discounts to the local market and restrict them to the young Londoners. Well, not necessarily young, but medium, middle income Londoners who haven't got a home, want to get on the property ladder, and have a local connection either through key worker or whatever. And those restrictions stay forever. And I thought that was a really impressive and clever way of solving the problem. You don't need to throw money at it. You just smart design. You could get some level of affordability in those homes. And to be honest, first-time buyers in the main, in global cities like London, are not buying 2 and 3 or 4 bedroom homes. They're buying 1 beds. Yeah. So if you can make those 1 beds nice, efficient, and affordable, that gets them on the ladder and that gets them started in life. And that was the proposition. And I tried to get it into Wandsworth. I didn't succeed at the time, but I did when I became a member, when I joined Pocket, because I left Wandsworth. And as a developer, knowing the borough, we managed to buy a site, and we did get Pocket homes into Wandsworth, and we had 50 odd Pocket homes, and we had over 1,000 people registered to buy with us, which just shows you how popular it is. And my greatest regret is in that scheme, Mapleton Crescent in Wandsworth, which is at the tallest modular tower in London. And an emerald terracotta green tower, really impressive piece of architecture that was delivered with Metropolitan Workshop. We only had 51 Pocket homes. We had some private flats to subsidise the costs, but those 50, we could have done 200 homes, and we would have sold them.
And just to clarify the model for our listeners, so if I'm a key worker, first time buyer, whatever, I go and buy a 1-bedroom Pocket home. Life's going good, career's progressing, family comes along, whatever. I want to trade out of that asset into something elsewhere or bigger. Am I restricted to sell that to solely somebody who fits the demographic?
Yeah, you are. You've got a restriction, so you can sell. The market's gone up. You can obviously sell at whatever the discount to market is that you bought it at. So you make a potential profit out of the home, but you don't make super profits from Pocket homes, but you create that equity that then you can roll into your next home. But and you can sell to people on restricted incomes of, I think it's 90,000 is the cap, so anyone under 90,000. Reality is it's people of 35 to 55,000 pounds that buy Pocket homes in London.
Right. But as you said, there's kind of an insatiable demand at that within that
big chunk
within that demographic.
Chunk of people,
So the business has gone from strength to strength, right? We're winning all kinds of awards. Now, how many boroughs of London have you?
You're testing me. I think we've probably developed schemes in about 20 of them now.
Wow.
Yeah, it's hard work. They're all different. They all have their own different approaches and views and mini ideologies. But yeah. I mean, one of the things that we've decided to do is to do fewer boroughs.
Really?
Just because although the demand might be consistent, the riders are not.
I'm not going to ask if Wandsworth is still on the list. I mean, that would be very
it should be from a demographic perspective, but whether it is on politicals, I don't know.
Okay, so vision for the future for the business. It's clearly supply, demand, affordability. If anything's got worse over the last 10 years, so where are you now? What is this? I guess the ethos is still very much the same.
Yes, I think we've about 3 or 4 years ago we pivoted to doing more rental, and we're probably more like 60% rent now. And I think the future will be innovative new homes around a rental offer, and very much keeping the Pocket home. So the traditional Pocket home, 38 square metre flat, is really good for rent, very popular. But augmenting that with a new sharer home. So we're working up several schemes now where we'll have a 3-bedroom sharer flat.
So what, you and I would co-own?
Rent.
Okay, rent.
So it'd be sharers for rent.
Yeah.
And we'll rent them by the room, and we'll have a sharer matching service. And a kind of if your friends decide to leave you, we'll guarantee the rent until we find someone else to come in and share with you. So the idea being that you get the kind of all the benefits of renting, but not necessarily the insecurity of having to find mates and you don't get married or decide they're not mates with you tomorrow or whatever, all that stuff. So you've got that kind of underpinning, and we kind of feel that's so a third of all new leases in London are for sharers at the moment. So it's already there.
Yes, for
but
sure.
No one's institutionalised it yet, and it's an alternative to co-living. And we were the original kind of compact developers, but obviously since then, you've brought in these new products like co-living, which is even smaller than Pocket. It's sort of anywhere from 12 to 25 square metre flats, which you rentalise. And we think there's loads of good things about co-living, by the way, and we haven't jumped into that yet, but we may still, and we may mix it with what we call Pocket Rent, where we have our own Pocket units which are affordable and discounted to market sometimes, alongside maybe some co-living. But it's a different style of, I suppose, a co-living offer, but it's done as a residential framework.
It was only this morning at an event that we held that I was talking to somebody about this, and I think co-living, I get it. For me, the product type is fascinating. But I remember when I moved to London with my then girlfriend, wife, 20 years ago. I mean, we went into a shared flat with some strangers. It wasn't it wasn't a product type, but everyone was doing it. So, I'm not a property developer, but it seems an absolute no-brainer to me. Why would that have changed when affordability is as challenging as it was then, if not more so?
I think it's strange it already hasn't happened, to be honest. And I mean, we've built the muscle in terms of our brand and what we offer to London. So we feel we're in a very strong place to do this and have it institutionally backed. But it's surprising in a city like London that there aren't others that try to institutionalise what is essentially an HMO offer.
Yeah, and so we've referenced London a lot. Is the vision for the business to remain very much within the M25 focused, or
if the mayor lets us? But yeah, I think London's a global city, and I think for us, we see London as the kind of the apex of residential anyway. That's not to say that there are not other cities that interest us and that we would be open to working with, but with the best will in the world, it's very, very hard to property's local, and we only have so many people on our platform to work these things. So whilst I wouldn't rule out other cities, I think we've got a lot on our plate in London.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of demand and plenty of challenges. So clearly, it's a decorated and interesting career. You're still a very much a young man and have your hands full at Pocket. I guess what I want to ask is, spanning the entire business now, in terms of your role, what is your happy place? What is the best part of your job? On a wet February Monday, get you out of bed with a smile on your face.
I think just being the commercial heart and soul of the business and making sure that feeds through to all the different parts of the operation, really. And whilst I have particular responsibilities, I'm also there to keep everyone commercially on track. So that can range between planning, development, construction, and everything, really.
Operations, I'm sure as well.
So being able to sort of ensure that people can come to me and talk to me through issues and problems and help them is quite a enlivening and fulfilling bit of the job beyond the day job, so to speak.
Yeah, I completely understand that. It's similar. My answer would be very similar in terms of what I do, but is it mean to ask you which part of the job is the most challenging, or
well, I think I find it quite frustrating and challenging to deal with politicians, because I was one, and so I kind of compare myself to them, and when they make bad decisions, which they tend to do, particularly around planning and development, it frustrates me immensely. I think the paucity of knowledge and information about how real estate works does enfeeble the sector and the housing crisis, particularly given the amount of responsibility and power that these people have been vested with as a consequence of the planning system. So that I find that very frustrating. I mean, there are great ones out there, by the way. I mean, there's lots of
course,
politicians who are trying to make it better, but it's swimming against the tide sometimes, it feels.
Yeah, well, again, back to this event this morning, we had 3 developers on stage and we asked them what's the one thing you'd change. All 3 of them said, well, sadly, number 2 and number 3 were a bit stumped, but number 1 said planning, unquestionably. And I've been knocking around the industry for 20 years now, and certainly these conferences, and I'm not sure I can listen to that answer for another 10 years. Do you see something fundamentally changing through your through your experience of working with politicians?
I think we as an industry have failed comprehensively to, and possibly it's indicative of your panel earlier, to have a cohesive view about what needs to change. I went to an event in the House of Commons a few weeks ago. It was an SME event with the housing minister, and some MPs were there too. None of them know anything about real estate, really, unfortunately, despite the fact that they have responsibilities over it. But one of the initial problems is just the way developers talk about the industry, and they always start with like, oh, in 1980 you could get a piece of paper with a red line and you get planning in 6 weeks, and then the next one goes, oh, well, I've got this development in York, and it's been in planning for 4 years. And of course the housing minister will go, oh, that's terrible, isn't it? I'll talk to the York, and it's just it's such an easy thing to just stick in the long grass, because there's nothing there. It's just anecdotes, and what we have to get away from is emotional, because it is very emotional.
Sure.
Vested. When I understand that, we're all vested in our schemes and we want to see them succeed, and we're all very frustrated by the irrationality of planning and other things in the world. But you've got to get over that, and we've got to, as a sector, get much better at articulating very simple points around what's not working, around planning and around development, and around finance, and start explaining to these people how the world works, because I think a lot of them don't really understand the world that they're in and the decisions they're making. And until we do that as a sector, you're right, I think things will stay in a fairly deadlocked fashion. I think there are some positive signs out there. Signs, not material changes. I think obviously the Labour Party talking about land use is a positive sign, because I think for too long we've been too binary between green and brown. I think there's a recognition in the House of Commons that the planning reforms that Robert Jenrick tried to promote are a missed opportunity. In retrospect, now looking at the housing numbers nationally, which will continue to fall, by the way, and they could get even much, much lower than they are now due to the challenges that the development sector faces. And I think there's a feel that perhaps something around zoning should be relooked at, because what Jenrick was trying to do was take the politics out, take the discretionary nature of the system out. Because when you create discretionary nature to anything, it doesn't really work, because everyone wants to buy and everyone wants a piece of it, and it just becomes a plaything. And that might be an abstract way of describing it, but it becomes a plaything fundamentally and we get beaten up as developers. But if you can get to a less discretionary system, and you can point to cities that have made it work, and I think Auckland in New Zealand's a good example of that, right, where actually it's a left-leaning administration. They brought in zoning, and they've actually witnessed not only a construction boom, but actually the house prices have leveled off and come down a bit, because supply has been allowed to feed through, and development has taken place, which has brought pricing into a better place. And Auckland's one of the most expensive cities in the world. So there are some examples out there now of good practice, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the politicians lose all their power, which clearly they're going to be worried about, but it just brings in a sensible place for everyone. So I am optimistic to an extent that some of this might get taken on in the next Parliament.
Oh God, I hope so. I just, it's just so frustrating. I'm not in the thick of it like you are, but I talk to people who are every day, and it's just so frustrating. And in my job, I get to travel the world a little bit more nowadays, and it's becoming embarrassing to a degree. When you sort of when you try to explain to somebody, even though I'm not the expert, the challenges of the planning system, they just sort of go a bit cross-eyed, like they can't comprehend.
And it's not just housing, is it? It's I have friends who are setting up businesses or growing businesses, in retail and other sectors, and they don't know how to get investment into their inventories and their stock and their warehouses or their front of house, because the planning system is as much a constraint for them as it is for house builders. So it's a cross-sectoral challenge, and a real break and friction on the UK to grow and prosper.
Well, as and when your time is done with Pocket, not suggesting that it should be or anytime soon, I would vote for you to dive in and solve that.
No thanks.
I'll
try my best. I'll try the best from the sidelines. So thank you.
Look, conscious of time, we keep these things to a tight time schedule, and you're a very busy man. So I guess looking to the future very quickly. How do you see the landscape of the London residential real estate ecosystem changing? We're approaching an election. Next year's an election year. 5 years' time, what's changed?
I think we'll see a lot. We're going to have to see a lot more innovation in the system. I mean, it's almost undoubtedly the case that we'll move away from traditional housing models to, I think, kind of what I was talking about. So sharer typologies. I think there'll be more co-living in the market. I think there's going to have to be lots of innovation around space because the paucity of land supply combined with the challenges around regulations and construction, you're just not going to be able to do the kind of, the traditional house builder model in a London environment. So you'll see much more density, probably not tall buildings though. I think as a sector we're going to probably be much more cautious about building residential towers due to the issues around the Building Safety Act, which no one really fully understands yet, but also just the cost and the risk associated. So you'll probably see more
pocket development,
clever development, clever. Not I would say pocket development, but yeah, you will see more infill, smart development, and also more reuse of existing buildings, I think.
Yeah, I hope to see that. Now, talking of time, you're incredibly busy. So my final sort of question is how you write one of the most well-read blogs in the industry, and we were just chatting before we press record, and you said you write it weekly. Tell me about that, and how do you get that done?
Well, I have 2 small children.
Well, they're writing it for you.
and I try and do it in nap time. So because I'm a captive audience at that point to them. So in the hour I've got, I'll try and furiously tap it out. And whilst they're shouting and crying at me, I'll try and write it in my head. And that's how I do it.
Well, I'm in awe of you. With 3 kids of my own, I really don't understand how you find the time together. But also, your audience. I mean, the content that you produce, I think, is so well respected and so timely. It's really fascinating. So long may that continue. We have to wrap this up. But you want to play some quick fire questions? We always play quick fire.
Yeah.
Please don't be the first person to say no.
No, go for it. Fire away. Yeah.
Okay, and I must confess, Laura, who you can't see, who's just tucked away here, she writes these, so it's for my first time. Sweet or savoury?
Savoury, because I don't believe in quick hits. I think you have to work at something. So, I'm work at something to enjoy it.
So, do you, when it comes to savoury, how are you working at it?
I take for example whiskey. I used to never like whiskey, but I mean I've spent a lot of time drinking whiskey lately.
Oh, so you've worked at it.
You've got to work at it, and then you realise that actually, savoury gives you a lot more reward over the long term.
No, I'm a savoury guy for sure. Hiking in nature or exploring urban streets?
I would probably say hiking in nature, just because I live in a global city like London, so
it's a rare retreat.
Yeah, I think it's nice to have a change of scene, isn't it? Not that I do either much these days.
Just drag one in each hand and off you go. Marvel or Star Wars?
Well, I think they're both overfished. So, I mean, I've lost the. I don't even know how. I don't understand the Star Wars storyline.
No. Well, we're probably of a very similar vintage, and I remember the first one's coming out being mind-blowing, and
yes,
I sort of
I mean, I think they're both a bit overdone now, really. So yeah,
agreed. Good question though, Laura, thank you. Bowie or the Beatles?
I like the Beatles' new song actually, but I'd probably say Bowie because of his hair, B, I think the songs are a little bit more sophisticated, and C, I'm a big fan of Labyrinth. I haven't got my daughters to watch it yet because they're still a little bit too young, but I'm going to try and get them into that. It's a great film.
Well, they were both great, as you said. And finally, we always ask this question of everybody who's kind enough to join us. If you could own any single property in the world, which one would it be and why?
Well, we were talking a bit earlier about the future being reusing buildings, and just for the intellectual challenge, I'd like to give the HSBC Tower a bit of a go. To two reasons. Firstly, I remember when I worked at CBRE, like it being traded by the City Investment Team about 4 times in the year that I was there between various owners. Obviously, it's not worth anything like it was when they were when they were trading it back then. But secondly, I just think it's a really interesting conundrum about what happens to it next, and could you design a residential scheme or a mixed use scheme in there? So I'd like to give that a go. I wouldn't want to actually put my own equity into it though. So like any developer.
Nick, on that note, it's been great, tremendously interesting career that you've had, and I'm in no doubt that you'll continue to be even more influential on London's landscape. I want to thank you for what you and Pocket and your colleagues have done and continue to do. It's really generous of you to join us today.
Thank you.
And I think it's time I took you for lunch.
Thank you. Pleasure. Thanks.